How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Last night we counted. We're in the 21st day of the Omer, almost halfway to Shavuos from Passover. Who's in the house? Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Nancy in North Carolina, Renee in Indiana, Stephen in New Hampshire. Skipped on me. Shandora in the Bronx, Lorraine in Texas, Sharon in New Jersey, Gail in Kansas City, Yehuda in South Carolina, Bella in Florida. And on the YouTube side, I need to reload so that I can see. Come on. Chaim in Florida, Mickey in New Jersey, Moshe saying Shavua Tov, and Norm in 29 Palms. Welcome, everybody. Also, John in Maine and Paola. Shalom from Seattle. That seems like a new name. Paola Sapoznik. I went to junior high with Lori Sapoznik. I wonder if you're related. Welcome, everybody. We are continuing our journey through Tractate Makkos, the 25th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 2, generally talking about the city of refuge, the place where the unintentional killer, the manslaughterer, who still bears some culpability, it wasn't a pure accident, there was some aspect of negligence, and the Torah provides for 6 cities of refuge in ancient Israel, to which the manslaughterer could flee and be safe from the avenger of blood, also called the blood redeemer. I mean, same term, Goel Hadam, depending on how you translate it into English. Okay, we are continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 6, I believe. Mishnah number 6, and with God's help, we'll get to Mishnahs 7 and 8 today. Can only do a single page, but it should set us up for a double daf tomorrow, a double page, as we slowly but surely get caught up. Okay, near, about how near the top? Yeah, pretty close to the top, third of the way down maybe, of page 10b. The Gemara resumes its discussion of the laws, the halachas of exile. So Rav Huna says, in the case of an unintentional murderer who is exiled to a city of refuge and the blood redeemer found him on the way and killed him, he is exempt. Right? Very, very interesting law, because when we think about how much the sages and the Torah goes out of its way to make it difficult for a court to impose the death penalty on a murderer, an actual murderer, an intentional murderer, even when we've proven by the testimony of witnesses that he was an intentional murderer, we're not always going to be able to apply the death penalty unless all kinds of conditions are met. But here there's a provision in the Torah for what is a completely extrajudicial, right, outside of a court procedure, death sentence of a manslaughterer, an unintentional murderer, by this self-appointed executioner, the avenger of blood. Now, we understand, particularly in the ancient world, if we're going to be realistic, you know, this was a part of the world where there were blood feuds. And there wasn't a police station down the street. There wasn't a phone to call the cops. Just the way that tribes in these, feudal areas dealt with these kinds of things is if somebody killed a member of your team, you had to go and kill that person and let them know that your team is not gonna, your team, your family, your community is not a soft target that people could just come and kill one of you, right? And so to maintain the peace, that was just the way that things were normally done. And it was within that kind of ecosystem, social system, that the Torah came and limited the ability of a blood redeemer, an avenger of blood, to extract that kind of vengeance on behalf of the relatives of the victim. But the Torah still makes provision that there is an avenger of blood, and if they kill somebody who killed the member of their family, it's okay. It works. Right? Now, we don't have that in modern times, of course, but it's just very interesting that this is in the Torah. Okay. So here we go, right? So let's just read that again. Rav Huna says, in the case of the unintentional murderer who was exiled to a city of refuge, so he's safe from the avenger of blood in the city of refuge, but the blood redeemer found him on the way. He hadn't made it to the city of refuge yet and killed him, then he is exempt, right? The avenger of blood is exempt for killing the manslaughterer. And the Gemara notes that Rav Huna holds that the verse, lest the blood redeemer pursue the murderer and strike him fatally, and for him there is no sentence of death, as he did not hate him from before, Deuteronomy 19:6, that this verse is written with regard to the blood redeemer, teaching that the blood redeemer is not liable to be executed for killing the murderer. That is the halacha. So the Gemara raises an objection to the opinion of Rav Huna. Pardon me, I didn't set this to showtime. The Gemara raises an objection to the opinion of Rav Huna from a baraisa. And for him, there is no sentence of death. This verse is speaking with regard to the manslaughterer, right? The unintentional murderer, teaching that the unintentional murderer is not liable to be executed. That is why the Jewish people were commanded to establish cities of refuge to protect him. And the Baraisa proceeds to prove that the verse is written with regard to the murderer. Do you say that it is speaking with regard to the unintentional murderer, or is it speaking only with regard to the blood redeemer? When it states in an earlier verse, and he did not hate him from before, Deuteronomy 19:4, it is clear that the reference is to the unintentional murderer, and therefore you must say that in the phrase, and for him there is no sentence of death, the verse is speaking with regard to the unintentional murderer. And if it's speaking to the unintentional murderer, for whom the sentence is exile, not death, how can you say that the avenger of blood it's permissible for him to kill the manslaughterer outside the city of refuge? And the Gemara answers, Rav Huna states his opinion in accordance with the opinion of that following Tana, as it is taught in another Baraisa, and for him there is no sentence of death. The verse is speaking with regard to the blood redeemer. The Baraisa clarifies, do you say that it is speaking with regard to the blood redeemer, or is it speaking only with regard to the unintentional murderer? When it states, and he did not hate him from before, the unintentional murderer is already stated, as that phrase certainly is referring to him. So what do I do with the verse, and for him there is no sentence of death? That one is stated with regard to the blood redeemer that the verse is speaking. He also is not going to be what's the word? He's not going to be indicted, right? Charges are not going to be brought against the blood redeemer for killing the manslaughterer, and this is the source for that. There is no sentence of death for him, for the blood redeemer. We already know there's no sentence of death for the one who is exiled, meaning the manslaughterer, but he's exiled to the city of refuge. So if the blood redeemer finds him outside the city of refuge, that's when he can kill him. The Gemara cites proof concerning Rav Huna's ruling from the Mishna. We learned in the Mishna, and they would provide the unintentional murderer fleeing to a city of refuge with 2 Torah scholars, due to the concern that perhaps the blood redeemer will seek to kill him in transit. And in that case, they will talk to the blood redeemer. Now, this is very interesting. So the point is that the manslaughterer fled to the city of refuge, right, on the day of the killing. He got to the city of refuge. Now he has to leave the city of refuge to come to his trial, where they're going to determine, is he indeed subject to exile? And then he's going to go back to the city of refuge. Or perhaps it really was an accident, and he doesn't have to be exiled. And then, there is no license for the blood redeemer to kill him because it was an accident. It was not manslaughter. Or perhaps it actually was an intentional murder, in which case, if they can convict him of that at the trial, well, he's not going back to the city of refuge because he's going to be executed. But assuming that it really was a manslaughter and he's going back to the city of refuge, and we're concerned that along the way, the blood redeemer might seek to kill him. So what are we going to do? we're going to chaperone him with Torah scholars. Not typically, big, strong, warrior, armed guard types. Why wouldn't we send 2 soldiers with him, 2 officers of the court? Why are we sending Torah scholars to guard the manslaughterer from the blood redeemer? And they would provide the unintentional murderer fleeing to a city of refuge with 2 Torah scholars due to the concern that perhaps the blood redeemer will seek to kill him in transit. And in that case, these 2 Torah scholars will talk to the blood redeemer. And the Gemara asks, well, what is it not that the Torah scholars forewarn him that if he kills the unintentional murderer, he would be liable to be executed? They know the law. They're going to function as both witnesses and issuing the forewarning. Hey, if you kill the manslaughterer, you're going to be subject to the death penalty. Okay, that would seem to be a good use for Torah scholars in this situation. But this would mean that the blood redeemer is not permitted to kill the manslaughterer, and that would seem to contradict the explicitly written verse in the Torah. That contradicts Rav Huna's opinion that a blood redeemer who kills the unintentional murderer is exempt. But the Gemara rejects this proof because, in fact, that is not the law. The blood redeemer is permitted to kill the manslaughterer, and how do we know? It says no. The statement of the Torah, the statement of the Torah scholars to the blood redeemer can be explained as it is taught in a baraisa. What are they going to say to the blood redeemer? They will speak to him about matters appropriate to him. They say to the blood redeemer, do not accord him treatment appropriate for murderers, as it was unintentionally that he came to be involved in the incident. Rabbi Meir says the unintentional murderer also speaks on his own behalf. Midaber, he speaks on his own behalf to dissuade the blood redeemer. As it is stated, and this is the matter, devar, the matter, of the murderer, who shall flee there and live. Deuteronomy 19:4, indicating that the murderer himself apologizes and speaks to the blood redeemer. And the sages say to Rabbi Meir, many matters are performed more effectively through agency. You see, it's not appropriate to have armed guards there because the blood redeemer can kill the manslaughterer. What we want is that he shouldn't desire to kill the manslaughterer. The Torah scholars are coming here to advocate for peace in the land, for peace between these 2 people, and to understand that his punishment is not death. His punishment is exile. He's going to have to live away from his home in this city of refuge, quite possibly for the rest of his life. He is being punished for that unintentional but somewhat negligent killing of your relative. And you don't want to kill him. That's not something you want to carry around yourself. Let's, elevate this whole scenario and allow the manslaughterer to go into exile as the Torah prescribes for him. Right? It's kind of beautiful, actually, this idea that we're elevating the spiritual status of the land through this interaction. And it's probably a good lesson. We should think so often, we're just dealing with people and what's going on in our own lives, our own arguments, our own problems, our own issues at work or with family or with neighbors. And imagine if every interaction had this capacity to elevate or deplete the spiritual level of our community, of our neighborhood, of our nation. Amazing, because it does. That's the kind of stakes we're always reckoning with. The Gemara analyzes the Baraisa. The master says in the Baraisa, it was unintentionally that he came to be involved in the incident. And the Gemara asks, well, isn't this obvious? As if it were intentionally that he killed a person, is he liable to be exiled? So the Gemara answers, yes, even intentional murderers flee to a city of refuge on occasion. Doesn't mean they're allowed to, it means that in the real world they do. The Gemara continues, and so it is taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, says, initially, either one who killed another unintentionally or one who killed another intentionally would hurry and flee to the cities of refuge and the court in his city would send for him and would bring him from there to stand trial. And the Brisa continues, with regard to one who was found liable to receive the death penalty for intentional murder, after the trial, the court would execute him. As it is stated, and the elders of his city shall send and take him from there and deliver him into the hands of the blood redeemer, and he shall die. And with regard to one who was not found liable to receive the death penalty, for example, if they deemed that it was due to circumstances beyond his control, a purely accidental death, well, then they freed him. As it is stated, and the congregation shall rescue the murderer from the hands of the blood redeemer. Now, with regard to one who was found liable to be exiled, the genuine manslaughterer, the court would restore him to his place in the city of refuge. As it is stated, and the congregation shall judge between the murderer and the blood redeemer, and the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge that he fled there. Restore him because he fled there, he came back for the trial, and then we're going to return him to the city of refuge. The Brisa continues, Rebbe says, the Torah does not command intentional murderers to flee to a city of refuge. Rather, the Torah is cognizant of the fact that in practice, in the real world, intentional murderers would exile themselves on their own, as they thought that they would be admitted to these cities, which would provide refuge for both unintentional and intentional murderers. And they do not know that only those who murder unintentionally are admitted to these cities, but those who murder intentionally are not admitted. Now, also, I think in the real world, there's going to be situations where it's not so clear. Was that an intentional killing? Does it qualify for manslaughter? Or do we actually say, no, that qualifies as intentional and subject to execution? We're not sure. Obviously, the murderer is hoping that if there's a chance it could be intentional, subject to execution, that rather will be found to be unintentional and subject to exile. But he won't know until the trial, so he might well flee to the city of refuge. Rabbi Lazar says, Rabbi Lazar says, an unintentional murderer is not admitted to a city of refuge whose majority consists of unintentional murderers. As it is stated, with regard to an unintentional murderer who fled to a city of refuge, and he shall speak his matters in the ears of the elders of that city. Right? When he gets there, he has to explain why he's there. That, this morning he woke up, his life was normal, and then this thing happened, and now he's a manslaughterer. He has to tell what happened, tell his story to the elders of the city of refuge. And he shall speak his matters in the ears of the elders of that city. That's Joshua 20, verse 4, indicating that there is some novel element in the matters that he seeks to convey to the elders of the town, but not when their matters are equal to his matters, as those elders made the same statements when they arrived at the city of refuge as unintentional murderers. In other words, there have to be elders in the city who live there and who are not manslaughterers, right? He has to recite what happened to people who are elders of the city and who are not themselves manslaughterers. So the majority of the city cannot be fellow manslaughterers, can't be purely a city of killers or a majority city of killers. And Rabbi Lazar says, an unintentional murderer is not admitted to a city in which there are no elders, as we require the fulfillment of the verse, and he shall speak in the ears of the elders of the city. And if there are no elders there, he can't do that. It was stated a city in which there are no elders is the subject of a dispute between Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi. One of them says an unintentional murder is admitted there, and one says an unintentional murderer is not admitted there. And the Gemara explains, according to the one who says that an unintentional murderer is not admitted to a city in which there are no elders, his reasoning is due to the fact that we require the presence of the elders of the city, and there are none. The verse says he shall tell the elders of the city, and there are no elders there. So he can't go there. He has to find some other city of refuge where there are elders. According to the other opinion, which says that the unintentional murderer is admitted to this city of refuge that now lacks elders, the reasoning of this sage is that he holds that speaking to the elders is merely a mitzvah ab initio, but it does not affect the city's status as a city of refuge. It would be preferable that there are elders there for him to recite what happened to. But if they're not there, it's nevertheless still a city of refuge. And then a city where there are no elders is the subject of another dispute between Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi. One of them says one can become a wayward and rebellious son in such a city, and the other one says one cannot become a wayward and rebellious son in it. And the Gemara explains, according to the one who says that one cannot become a wayward and rebellious son in a city without elders, it is due to the fact that we require the presence of the elders of the city for the verse, as it is written in Deuteronomy 21:19, and his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city and the gate of his place. And there are no elders there. So according to the one who says that one can become a wayward and rebellious son in it, the presence of the elders is merely a mitzvah ab initio, but is not required to proceed with that mitzvah. Again, the sages legislated the law of the wayward and rebellious son completely out of existence. This is a young man who's such a glutton that he's destined to become a murderer. And before that happened, the Torah says you should take him to the gate of the city and stone him to death. The parents will bring him to that court and they will find him guilty and kill him for crimes he hasn't committed yet. The idea is we should keep close tabs on somebody who's headed toward a life of crime. Thematically, we learn that. But in point of fact, there never was a case in Jewish history of a wayward and rebellious son who was executed in that manner. So it's so interesting that a law that was never put in place and was clearly not meant to be put in place, why was it included in the Torah? So that we would study it. But we studied it on a different day. And a city in which there are no elders is the city of yet another dispute between Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi. One says if a corpse was found proximate to that city, the inhabitants of the city bring a heifer whose neck is broken, and the other one says that the inhabitants of the city do not bring the heifer whose neck is broken. This is when a corpse is discovered between towns. It was the victim of murder, but we don't know who it is or who committed the murder. We're not going to be able to find out. Still, there's a ceremony that needs to be performed to atone for this unsolved murder in the land of Israel. They measure which is the nearest town, and then the elders of that town come out and recite a certain litany that's in the Torah, that we didn't kill this man and we don't know who killed this man. But there's this sense that perhaps we weren't hospitable enough to him, and that's why he was caught between towns and killed by some brigand. And so this ceremony is performed. But the Torah says that there have to be elders of the town to do that. And in a town where there are no elders, can we perform this ceremony or not? You see, it's a debate between Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi. Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina says, for what reason was the portion discussing murderers stated with harsh language? Now we're on page 11a. As it is written, quote, and the Lord spoke, Vayedaber, to Joshua, saying, speak, daber, to the children of Israel, saying, assign you the cities of refuge of which I spoke, dibarti, to you by means of Moses. That's Joshua 20, verses 1 and 2. Now, why does the Torah repeatedly employ a term of dibur, connoting harsh speech, right? Emphatic speech. Not just speaking, not quite commanding, but this tone of harsh speech. Why does the Torah use this for this passage? It is due to the fact that the cities of refuge are a mitzvah of the Torah, and therefore they warrant emphasis. And the Gemara asks, is that to say that all instances of speaking, when the verb dibur is used in the Torah, that they always indicate harsh language? And the Gemara answers, yes, as it is written with regard to Joseph's brothers, the man, the Lord of the land, spoke, diber, harshly to us. Right? This is when Joseph has become the viceroy of Egypt, and the brothers go there seeking food during the famine, and Joseph recognizes them, but they don't realize that this is their brother that they sold into slavery, who's now the second most powerful man in the world after Pharaoh. And so they said that he spoke harshly to us, which is not surprising. And the Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Baraisa with regard to the verse, then they who feared the Lord spoke, nidberu, same root, with one another, Malachi 3:16, that the term they spoke is nothing other than a term of gentleness. And likewise, the same is true of the verse which states in Psalm 47, verse 4, he subdues, yedaber, peoples under us, meaning that God will calmly and gently conduct the nations under the influence of the Jewish people. And the Gemara answers, the meaning of diber is discreet, and the meaning of yedaber is discreet. There's a difference between those two conjugations of the same root. And one has this note, this nuance of connotes harshness, and the other doesn't. So the Gemara now provides a mnemonic for the disputes involving Rabbi Yehuda that follow. Rabbis, Meheni, I'm talking about Rabbi Nehemiah, and the dispute with regard to Torah scrolls sewn with threads of flax scrolls. So the Gemara resumes a discussion of the harsh language employed in the portion discussing murderers in the book of Joshua. Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis disagree with regard to this matter. One says harsh language was employed because Joshua delayed fulfilling the mitzvah of designating cities of refuge. And the other one says it is because the cities of refuge are a mitzvah of the Torah, and therefore they warrant emphasis. This is something that needs to be done. So either this harsh note of diber was introduced because Joshua was a little late in getting the city set up, or because there's something about this area of the law, which you can see why, requires some emphasis from the Torah to make sure you get this done, and some harshness about it. Okay? So the Gemara cites an additional dispute with regard to the portion of the cities of refuge in the book of Joshua. It is written, and Joshua wrote these matters in the scroll of the Torah of God. Joshua 24:26. And Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah disagree with regard to this matter. One of them says the references to the final 8 verses in the Torah that record the death of Moses. Right, the whole Torah is written by Moses. But what about the verses that record the death of Moses? Did Moses write about his own death as if it had already happened? Obviously, he wasn't alive to write that. So one theory is, God dictated to him that he write the verses in which he dies. And he just took the dictation from God. And the other view is that after Moses died, Joshua wrote the last 8 verses of the Torah describing the death of Moses. And one says, no, what we're talking about here is a reference to the portion of the cities of refuge that appears in the book of Joshua. So the Gemara discusses these two opinions. Now, granted, according to the one who says that the reference is to the final 8 verses in the Torah, that is the reason that it is written, and Joshua wrote these matters in the scroll of the Torah of God, as he wrote those verses and they were included in the Torah. But according to the one who says that the reference is to the portion of the cities of refuge in the book of Joshua, which is the 6th book of the Bible and not part of the Torah, why is it referred to as the scroll of the Torah? Right? But according to the one who says that the reference is to the portion of the cities of refuge in the book of Joshua, what is the meaning of the phrase, in the scroll of the Torah of God? They appear in the book of Joshua, not in the Torah. So the Gemara answers, this is what the verse is saying. And Joshua wrote in his book these matters that are also written in the scroll of the Torah of God. And the Gemara proceeds to cite another dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and one of the sages, in which it is not clear which opinion is attributable to which sage. In the case of a Torah scroll where one sewed its sheets with linen threads, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir disagree with regard to this matter. We don't know who says what, but one of them says the Torah scroll is fit for use, and the other one says the Torah scroll is unfit for use. Right? If you ever see a Torah scroll in a synagogue when we unroll it to read in the public reading of the Torah, looks like paper, but it's not. Right? What are the words of the Torah written on? Animal hide, right? The pages are vellum. It's made out of animal hide, and they're cut into squares that are sewn together. And since it's made out of animal hide, we also have a tradition that the sheets have to be sewn together with animal hide, right? Another piece of the animal known as sinew. I guess sinew is probably from the guts of the animal, but the point is it's also an animal product. So how do we know? So the question is, if the sheets of hide were sewn together not with sinew, but with a vegan product, right? Flax thread, is this Sefer Torah, this scroll of the Torah, kosher or not? So according to the one who says that the Torah scroll is unfit for use if the sheets are sewn together with flax, the reason is, as it is written with regard to tefillin, and it shall be for you a sign on your hand and a symbol before your eyes, in order that the Torah of God shall be in your mouth. Exodus 13:9. And in this verse, the entire Torah is juxtaposed and likened to tefillin. And just as with regard to tefillin, there is a law transmitted to Moses from Mount Sinai, when the original oral instructions at Mount Sinai, to sew them with sinews. So too, with regard to all sheets of the Torah scroll, there is a requirement to sew them with sinews. And by the way, that is the law. A Torah scroll must be sewn with sinews, or it is not kosher. And the other sage holds when the Torah scroll is juxtaposed and likened to tefillin, it is only with regard to the principle that the sheets of the Torah scroll may be prepared only from a species of animal that is permitted in your mouth, i.e. that is permitted to a Jew to eat from a kosher animal hide. But with regard to its other laws, it is not juxtaposed and likened to tefillin. We don't follow that. Rav said, I saw that the tefillin of the house of my uncle, Rabbi Chia, were sewn with linen, but the law is not in accordance with his opinion. Tefillin may be sewn only with sinews, and likewise a Torah scroll. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 2. Now, Mishnah 7. The Torah states that an unintentional murderer is required to remain in the city of refuge to which he fled until the death of the high priest. And the Mishnah explains, with regard to high priests who were appointed in several different ways, one anointed with the anointing oil, which was the method through which high priests were consecrated until the oil was sequestered toward the end of the first temple period. After that, there was no more of the anointing oil. And so when a high priest became a high priest, there was a different way to consecrate him as the high priest. Right? In the early period, in the first temple period, we used this anointing oil that was created in the desert by Moses. And they had that for hundreds and hundreds of years. But eventually, it was hidden away. It wasn't that they ran out, but it was hidden away along with the ark, lest it fall into enemy hands. And so later in the second temple period, there was no anointing oil. There was no ark in the Holy of Holies. But there were high priests who would enter there on Yom Kippur. So how were they anointed? Well, there were other ways to consecrate them as the high priest. So the second way was one consecrated by donning multiple garments. In other words, there is the clothing that only a high priest wears, and when a priest who has the 4 standard garments of a priest serving in the Holy Temple then puts on the 4 additional garments of the high priest, once you put on the clothes, then you are a high priest. Right? Obviously, it's not you just sneak it on and you become the high priest. That he's been selected to be the high priest, and when he puts on the clothes of the high priest, he is the high priest. So at that point, right, he has been appointed the high priest, consecrated to serve as the high priest. So the first way is the anointing oil, second way is putting on the clothes. And what does it say? And one who received a temporary, right, so the multiple garments. And number 3, one who received a temporary appointment due to the unfitness of the serving high priest, who departed from his anointment with the restoration of the serving high priest to active service. All of them, their debts facilitate, right? Even one who served as a high priest temporarily, but then went back to being a regular priest, but he had been a high priest at one point. Any of these, one who was anointed with the oil, one who became a high priest by putting on the clothes, one who was temporarily a high priest, but then went back to being a priest. If any of these 3 die while there are people, right, exiled to a city of refuge, the exile is over. They can now return to their homes. All of these facilitate the return of the murderer from the city of refuge to his home. Rabbi Yehuda says even the death of a priest anointed for war to address the soldiers facilitates the return of the murderer. Right? The priest anointed for war is just a regular priest who then gets anointed as a priest, a high priest anointed for war. He can go out with the army and, give them the encouraging speech on the eve of battle. That's his job. And he is a high priest serving that capacity. So if he dies, also the manslaughterers can return to their homes. The Mishnah continues, therefore, and for this reason, right, that all these people who are exiled, manslaughterers, right, who are going to be in that city of refuge, Could be 1 year, could be 50 years. So all of them are waiting for the high priest to die. So what do you think their attitude toward high priests is? Therefore, the mothers of high priests would provide those exiled to the cities of refuge with sustenance and garments, so that they would not pray that the sons of these mothers would die. The more comfortable their lives were in the city of refuge, the less urgency they would feel to leave, and the less likely it would be that they would pray for the death of the high priests. Right? The moms of the high priests didn't want these manslaughterers praying for their sons to die so that they could return to their homes. That's Mishnah 7. Now the Gemara. And so the Gemara asks, from where are these matters that the death of all these different kinds of high priests, or they're all high priests, but different ways in which they became high priests, that the death of any of these facilitates the return of the murderer? From where is this derived? Rav Kahana said they are derived from a verse. As the verse states about the manslaughterer, and he shall dwell there until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the sacred oil. And it is also written, for in his city of refuge he shall dwell until the death of the high priest. And it is further written, and after the death of the high priest, the murderer shall return to his ancestral land. Seems like the same law was stated 3 times. Why was it stated 3 times? To tell us that any one of these kinds of high priests would, upon their death, the manslaughterers can go home. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that another verse is written, and you shall take no ransom from him that fled to his city of refuge to return and dwell in the land until the death of the priest, from which it is derived that the death of the priest anointed for war also facilitates the return of the murderer. And the other Tana says from the fact that the high priest is that high priest, it says the death of the priest here in this fourth passage, but it doesn't say high priest, it doesn't say Kohen Gadol. So for that reason, the other view is that this fourth one does not include the priest anointed for war. And from the fact that high priest is not written in that verse, it is clear that the reference is not to an additional type of high priest, rather the reference is to one of those high priests mentioned in the preceding verses. Now the Mishnah teaches, therefore, the mothers of the high priests would provide those exiled to cities of refuge with sustenance and garments so that they would not pray that their sons will die. And the Gemara asks, the reason that the high priest will not die is that they do not pray. But if they prayed for the death of the high priest, they would die? Are we saying that these manslaughterers, right, who've been exiled for the rest of their lives, or at least until the high priest dies, that their prayers are so dear to God that God is going to kill or cause to die a high priest because these guys want to go home? Does that make sense? But isn't it written, quote, as the wandering sparrow, as the flying swallow, so is a curse that is baseless shall come home. Proverbs 26:2. Now, why does the Mishnah express concern over a baseless curse? Right? If we're concerned that these people are going to pray for the high priest to die so they can go home, why should we think that God is going to listen to such a prayer? Well, a certain elder said to him, I heard in the lecture delivered by Rava that it is not a baseless curse, as the high priests share the blame for the unintentional murders performed by these people, as they, the high priests, should have pleaded for mercy for their generation, that no negligent murder should transpire. All right, that no murder at all should transpire, even unintentionally. And perhaps they did not plead in this manner. And it was due to their share in the blame that prayers for their deaths could be effective. And some teach a variant reading of the Mishnah. Therefore, the mothers of the high priest would provide those exiled to the cities of refuge with sustenance and garments, so that those exiled would pray that their sons will not die. And the Gemara answers, the reason that the high priest will not die is that they pray, but if they didn't pray for the high priest, then the high priest would die. Right? In other words, one is the first variation is the mothers pray that these people, the mothers give them sustenance so that they won't pray that the high priest dies. Second version, she wants them to pray that their son will not die. right? And so the Gemara is asking, so we're saying if these guys don't pray for the high priest not to die, then the high priest will die? Like these guys, their prayers are so healthy, are so holy that they will keep the high priest alive when he would have otherwise died? What could the high priest have done to prevent the unintentional murder? Well, here in Bavel, they have an adage to describe a situation of this sort. Tavya sinned and Zigud is flogged. Right? It's just a saying. What does it mean? It means that it's like a guy named Tavya violated a prohibition, and Zigud came as a single witness to testify against him. Since the testimony of a single witness is not valid in court, he is flogged for defaming Tovia. So the sinner does not get punished, and the person who sought to testify against him is flogged. This became a colloquialism for a situation where one is punished for the sin of another. There in Eretz Yisrael, they say a different adage with the same application. Shechem married a woman, and Mavgai circumcised himself. Right? This is based on the episode of the abduction of Dinah in the city of Shechem in Genesis 34, where Shechem compelled all the male residents of the city to undergo circumcision so that he could marry Dinah. Shechem married Dinah, while the rest of the males suffered the pain of circumcision and received no benefit. Indeed, in the end, they not only received no benefit, but all of the males of the city were killed by Shimon and Levi because Shechem wanted to marry Dinah. A certain elder said to him, I heard in the lecture delivered by Rava that the high priest share the blame, as they should have pleaded for mercy for their generation, and they did not plead. Consequently, they required the exiles to pray on their own behalf. So the Gemara illustrates the concept of the responsibility held by the spiritual leadership. This is like in this incident, where a certain man was eaten by a lion at a distance of 3 parsangs from the place of the residence of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, and Elijah the prophet did not speak with him for 3 days. He was speaking with him every day, but for 3 days he stayed away, just because some guy was eaten by a lion, let's say 3 miles away or 30 miles away. Because of his failure to pray that an incident of this kind would not transpire in his place of residence. I mean, is it that he failed to pray and that's why it happened? Did he really have that much power? Perhaps. I mean, if Elijah is visiting you and telling you that, yeah, you have a spiritual stature, that if you would pray on behalf of your community would be safe, and you don't pray in that manner, then you have some kind of culpability. Who has the spiritual stature of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi? Probably none of us. But who knows? Who knows? Maybe if enough of us pray for each other, it will somehow put us over the top, and we as a community, as a nation, will be safer than if we weren't all crying out to God. And maybe each one of us is that one guy, that one gal, that one person whose one prayer will put us over the top as a community and keep us all safe. We all have to be praying not only for our own needs, but for the community needs, for the communal needs. Apropos curses that are realized, Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, with regard to the curse of a sage, even if it is baseless, i.e. it is based on a mistaken premise, it nevertheless comes to fruition and affects the object of the curse. From where do we derive this? It is derived from the incident involving Achisophel, who was one of David's generals. When David dug the drain pipes in preparation for building the temple, the waters of the depths rose and sought to inundate the world. And David said, what is the law? Is it permitted to write the sacred name on an earthenware shard and throw it into the depths so that the water will subside and stand in its place? There was no one who said anything to him. David said, anyone who knows the answer to this matter and does not say it shall be strangled. Then Ahisophel raised a Kal V'chomer inference on his own, and he said, and if in order to make peace between a man and his wife in the case of a sota, the suspected adulteress, when the husband suspects his wife of having committed adultery, in that situation the Torah says, my name that was written in sanctity shall be erased on the water, right? The name of God is written on the parchment that is then put in the waters, the waters of the bitterness, the bitter waters of strife. The bitter waters that the sota drinks. So the point is that the ritual causes a verse from the Torah that includes God's name to be written in ink that is, not permanent ink, and so God's name is erased in that process for the sake of having peace in the home. Then kal v'chomer, where we have an opportunity to save many people's lives by causing God's name to be erased in this situation they're describing. Of course we do it. Basically, we set aside any kind of legal matter, any Torah matter, in order to save lives. In fact, we're commanded to set aside law when it's possible to save a life, right? So Ahisophel figures that out, right? The Torah says, my name that was written in sanctity shall be erased on the water. Then, in order to establish peace for the whole world in its entirety, is it not all the more so permitted? Ahisophel said to David, yes, it is permitted for you to, write God's name on a shard and throw it in there, even though God's name will be erased. So David wrote the sacred name on the earthenware shard, and he cast it into the depths, and the waters of the depths subsided and stood in its place. Right? So Ahisophel did the right thing. He spoke up and saved the world. But David had said, if somebody knows it and doesn't say it, he shall be strangled. So why would this apply to Ahisophel? Well, he ended up being the one, and David was at such a lofty spiritual stature that since he spoke about somebody that he's going to be strangled, his curse ends up coming true. That's why people who are operating at a high spiritual level have to be so careful, so careful with their words. And that's why we see so often in the Gemara, when we're talking about, Jewish people acting wickedly, we don't say that Jewish people acted wickedly, God forbid. We say the enemies of the Jews acted in that manner. We see that kind of euphemism all the time, and this is why. And even so, it is written that during the rebellion of Absalom, and Ahisophel saw that his counsel was not taken. And he saddled his donkey, and he arose, and he went to his house, to his town, and he commanded his household, and he strangled himself. Right? He killed himself because of the situation in the nation at that time. So although David had stipulated years earlier that his curse would take effect only if one who knows the answer fails to share it with him, and Ahisophel did not fail to share it with him, nevertheless the curse was realized. And the Gemara cites a similar statement. Rabbi Abahu says, with regard to the curse of a sage, even if it is stated conditionally, it comes to realization. From where do we derive this? It is derived from an incident involving Eli the high priest. As Eli said to Samuel the prophet, after the latter had received a prophetic vision with regard to Eli, that his sons do not follow his path, therefore may God do to you and more also, if you hide any matter from me of all the matters that he spoke unto you. From 1 Samuel 3:17. And even though it is written immediately afterward, and Samuel told him all the matters and did not hide from him, it is written at the time of Samuel's death, and his sons did not follow in his ways, indicating that God did to Samuel as he prophesied with regard to Eli, and his own sons did not follow his path. Despite the fact that Eli stated the curse conditionally, Samuel was affected by the curse. Now we're on page 11b. Apropos declarations that take effect even if they were stated conditionally and the condition was not fulfilled, Rav Yehuda says that Rav says ostracism was declared conditionally. Ostracism that was declared conditionally requires nullification, even though the condition was not fulfilled. From where to derive this? It is derived from Judah, as it is written with regard to his request that his father allow the brothers to take Benjamin to Egypt. If I do not bring him to you, I would have sinned to you for all time. I.e., I'll remain ostracized as a sinner. And Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani says that Rabbi Yonason says, what is the meaning of that which is written, let Reuben live and not die, in Deuteronomy 33:6, followed immediately by the verse, and this for Judah? In Deuteronomy 33:7, why was the blessing of Judah linked to that of Reuben? It's because this idea that Judah, the condition that would have resulted in him being ostracized from his father Jacob and from his family, from the Jewish people, the condition was not met. But because Judah spoke about himself, that such a thing could happen to him, and Judah was a lofty sage, some of that ended up becoming true. And so I'm just to ellipse a little bit since the hour is so late. But basically, Judah's bones were carried out of Egypt to be buried in Israel. And his bones were rattling around until Moses prayed on his behalf that ostracism that Judah sort of spoke about himself, that it should be canceled, right? And that Judah his bones should be at peace. Because Judah's soul is in the world of souls and admitted to the heavenly academy and has the strength to sort of engage in Torah discourse and argumentation and debate at the level of the other sages in the heavenly academy. He didn't get that privilege, and his bones were not at rest until Moses prayed for that mercy for Judah. And then his bones finally stopped rattling around in this, I guess this box, this reliquary that was carrying his bones back to the land of Israel. His bones didn't cease rattling until Moses prayed for all those mercies for Judah. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 7. Now we go to Mishnah number 8 on page 11b. If after the unintentional murderer's verdict was decided and he was sentenced to exile, the high priest died, well, then he is not exiled, as the death of the high priest exempts him from exile. This would be the ideal scenario for a manslaughter, that once he's convicted and sentenced to exile, right away, like that next day, the high priest dies. He never has to go back to the city of refuge. He could just go on with his life because he was sentenced and then the high priest died. But if the high priest died before his verdict was decided, and they appointed another in his place, and thereafter the verdict was decided, then he returns from exile with the death of the second high priest. In other words, this would be the worst case for the manslaughterer, that there's a brand new high priest appointed before. The old high priest died before his verdict. Right, then he got a verdict, and then there's a new high priest appointed. Then this is brand new high priest. He has the longest possible lifespan, and this manslaughter cannot return home until that high priest dies, who just started serving as a high priest. Now, if the verdict of murder was decided at a time when there was no high priest, and likewise in the cases of one who unintentionally killed the high priest himself, and in the case of a high priest who killed unintentionally, in all these situations, the unintentional murderer, the manslaughterer, never leaves the city of refuge. Right? Isn't that something? You would think that, okay, well, when they held his trial, it was between high priests. There was no high priest. Okay, well, then, he has his trial. He gets exiled. He goes to the city of refuge. Eventually, they appoint a high priest. So you would think it'd be when that high priest dies. But no. If he was sentenced to exile in a period when there was no high priest, when they were between high priests, then that particular manslaughterer is going to spend the rest of his life in the city of refuge. So presumably, if high priest has died, then somebody comes up is due to be tried for manslaughter that could result in exile. Presumably, they would wait with that trial until a new high priest had been appointed in case it produces a verdict of exile, so that eventually he can come home when the high priest dies. And one who is exiled may not leave his city at all, either for testimony relating to a mitzvah, or for testimony relating to monetary matters, or for testimony relating to capital matters. And even if the Jewish people require his services, and even if he is the general of the army of Israel, like Yoav ben Zeruiah, he never leaves the city of refuge, as it is stated, and the congregation shall restore him to a city of refuge that he fled there, from which it is derived. There shall be his dwelling, there shall be his death, there shall be his burial. The only time he can leave that city of refuge is when the high priest dies. For no other reason may he leave, because when he leaves, he is subject to be killed by the avenger of blood. The Mishnah continues, just as an unintentional murderer is admitted to the city of refuge, so is he admitted to its outskirts, located within the Shabbos boundary, so 2,000 cubits in every direction. of the city of refuge. That is going to be where he can be, right? He doesn't have to be in prison for the rest of his life. He can just be in a working city, and he can go 2,000 cubits outside the city, but that's it. This guy, his days of traveling are over until the high priest dies. Once he entered the outskirts of the city, the blood redeemer may not kill him. In a case where a murderer, right, manslaughter, emerged beyond the Shabbos boundary of the city of refuge and the blood redeemer found him there, Rabbi Yosei HaGalili says it is a mitzvah, right, it is a commandment for the blood redeemer to kill him, and it is optional for every other person to do so. Rabbi Akiva says it is optional for the blood redeemer. He doesn't have to kill. That's why we provided the Torah scholars to try to talk him out of it. And every other person is liable for killing him, right, is not permitted to kill. That's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Where did this law end up? One who fled to a city of refuge and then intentionally left the city has placed himself in danger of being killed. It is permitted for the blood redeemer to kill him. And if any other person kills him, that person is liable. This is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and that is the law. Now here in the Koran, it says any other person who kills is not liable. And this is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, but that's not the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. So I think there's just a mistake in the note that writes the halacha here in the Koran. But we'll move on. That was the Mishnah, now the Gemara. The Mishnah teaches, if after the unintentional murderer's verdict was decided and he was sentenced to exile, the high priest died, the unintentional murderer is not exiled. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason for this? Abaye says it is derived from a kal v'chomer inference. If one who was already exiled now emerges with the death of the high priest, with regard to one who was not yet exiled, is it not right that he should not be exiled? But the Gemara rejects this reasoning. And perhaps with regard to this one who was already exiled, his sin was atoned for by his being exiled and serving that exile. And therefore the death of the high priest facilitates his return. But this one who was sentenced to be exiled and then the high priest dies the next day, no, his sin was not atoned for because he was never exiled. So therefore the death of the high priest should not prevent his exile. But the Gemara rebuts this and says, is it his exile that atones for his sin? No, it is the death of the high priest that atones for his sin. And the high priest has died, so that's why he never has to go into exile. The Mishnah teaches if it was before his verdict was decided that the high priest died and they appointed another in his place and thereafter his verdict was decided, he returns with the death of the second high priest. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? Rav Kahana says they're derived from the verse, as the verse states, and he shall dwell there until the death of the high priest, whom he anointed with the sacred oil. Now, is it the unintentional murderer who anoints the high priest? Rather, the reference is to that high priest who was anointed during his days, after he committed the unintentional murder. And the Gemara asks, why is his return home dependent on the death of the second high priest? Earlier on page 11a, the Gemara explained that the high priest bears a share of the responsibility for the unintentional murders, as he should have pleaded for mercy for his generation, and he did not do so. In this case, as the high priest in question was appointed only after the murder transpired, what could he have done to prevent the unintentional murder? And the Gemara answers, he should have pleaded for mercy that the verdict of the unintentional murderer would be decided by the court favorably, so that he would not be sentenced to exile. And this he did not plead for. Abaye said, we have a tradition that with regard to an unintentional murderer whose verdict was decided and who was sentenced to exile, and he died before he was exiled to the city of refuge, one transports his bones to the city of refuge and buries him there, as it is written, to return and dwell in the land until the death of the priest. And what is the dwelling that is in the land? You must say it is referring to his burial, right? But dwelling in the land itself. We're talking about burial. And a sage taught if an unintentional murderer died in a city of refuge before the high priest died, one transports his bones to the graves of his ancestors only after the high priest died. As it is written, the murderer shall return to his ancestral land. And what is the dwelling that is taking place in his ancestral land? You must say it is his burial. Now, the Gemara cites a dispute with regard to a case where the murderer's verdict was decided, i.e. he was sentenced to exile, and the high priest filling the position at the time was deemed the son of a divorced woman or the son of a chalutza. In other words, if the high priest, it was found that he was never qualified to be a priest, he became disqualified. Then what? So there was a high priest at the time that he was sentenced to exile, but it turned out that the high priest was not a qualified high priest. So Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak Napacha disagree with regard to this matter. One of them says the priesthood died, i.e., it is as though the high priest died and all exiles return home from the city of refuge. And the other one says the priesthood was voided, i.e., it is as though there was no high priest filling the position during that period. Therefore, these exiles may never leave the city of refuge. And the Gemara suggests, let us say that these Amoraim, Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yitzchak Napacha, disagree with regard to the issue that is the subject of a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, as we learned in the Mishna, Tractate Terumos. If a priest was standing and sacrificing offerings upon the altar and it became known that he was the son of a divorced woman or the son of a chalutza, and he was disqualified from the temple service, Rabbi Eliezer says all the offerings that he sacrificed up to that point are not valid, as it is apparent that he is not and never was fit for temple service. But Rabbi Yehoshua deems all those offerings that he already sacrificed valid. When we thought he was a priest, he was bringing offerings, and those are valid offerings. Until he's disqualified, it's only those offerings that he would have brought afterward that are disqualified. The Gemara explains, let us say that the one who says here that the priesthood died holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. He holds that the high priest is disqualified only from the time of discovery that he was disqualified from the priesthood and forward, while any service performed previous to that discovery is valid. The discovery that he is disqualified from the priesthood is like the death of a high priest, but his priesthood is not invalidated retroactively. And the other view, the one who says that the priesthood is voided, holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And since his priesthood was voided retroactively, there was no high priest filling the position when he was sentenced. Therefore, these would be the exiles who never return home. Now we're at the page 12a. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara rejects this parallel. According to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, everyone agrees that he holds that the priesthood is voided, and when they disagree, it is according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. The one who says the priesthood is dead holds in accordance with the straightforward understanding of the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua. And the one who says that the priesthood is voided can also hold in accordance with his opinion and explain that Rabbi Yehoshua states his opinion only there with regard to the temple service. As it is written, bless God, his property, and accept the work of his hands. The term property, chelo, is interpreted homiletically to mean that even the offerings of those disqualified from temple service due to flawed lineage, halalim, are accepted after the fact. But here, with regard to the status of the priest, even Rabbi Yehoshua concedes that the priesthood is voided retroactively. The Gemara teaches, the Mishna taught, if the verdict of a murderer was decided at a time when there is no high priest, and likewise in cases of one who unintentionally killed a high priest, or in the case of a high priest who himself killed unintentionally, the unintentional murderer never leaves the city of refuge. And one who is exiled may not leave the city at all, even if the Jewish people require his services. And even if he is the general of the army of the Jewish people, like Yoav ben Zeruiah, he does not leave the city of refuge ever. And Rav Yehuda says that Rav says Yoav made two errors at that moment when he fled from Solomon, as it is written, and Yoav fled to the tent of God and grasped the horns of the altar. This is before the temple was built, when we still had the tabernacle standing at Shiloh, or I guess now in Jerusalem, and the horns of the altar, of the altar that was built in the wilderness and served as the altar until Solomon's temple was built, and there was a permanent altar built there. Now Yoav, right, who basically, when Solomon became king, his father told him, left instruction for him, that, you need to execute Yoav because of what Yoav did, earlier. And so Yoav, knowing that Solomon now wants to kill him, ran to the tabernacle and to the altar and, grabbed the horns of the altar. And he said, well, you can't kill me while I'm holding the horns of the altar. But he did not understand the law, and they did kill him. So what was the mistake that he made? He erred in that only the top of the altar provides refuge, and he grasps its corners,
Moreover, he erred that only the altar of the eternal house, i.e. the temple, provides refuge, and he grasped the altar at Shiloh. So Abaye said, it is with regard to this that Yoav also erred, as the altar provides refuge only for a priest to grasp the roof of the altar, and his service is in his hand, and Yoav was not a priest. Apropos errors, the Gemara cites that which Reish Lakish says. The angel of Rome is destined to make 3 errors, as it is written, who is this who comes from Edom, understood to be, right? Edom is another name for Asaph, Jacob's twin brother, and we understand that Rome, right, the founders of Rome are the descendants of Asaph. Who is this who comes from Edom, who crimson garments from Bozrah? Isaiah 63:1. This is a parable for God's arrival after killing the angel of Rome in Bozrah. The angel of Rome will err in that it is only the city of Bezer that provides refuge, and he exiled himself to Bozrah. And he will err in that it provides refuge only to an unintentional murderer, and he was an intentional murderer. And he will err in that it provides refuge only for a person, and he is not a human, he is an angel. Mystical matters indeed. Okay, 3 comments. Number 1 from Lucy. If someone killed someone by accident, but was not judged eligible for exile, can the blood redeemer kill him? No, right? No. If it was judged that it was an accident, right? If it's not exile, then that means it was an accident. And if it was an accident, the blood redeemer does not have a right to kill. And if the blood redeemer did kill one who had his trial and it was deemed an accident, and the blood redeemer kills him because he doesn't agree with the verdict of the court, now the blood redeemer is a murderer, and he would be subject to trial for murder. Lorraine, with regard to talking to the blood redeemer, sounds so polite, right, that the Torah scholars will try to talk the blood redeemer out of killing the manslaughterer. Lorraine says, yeah, it sounds so polite in a situation where emotions would be high. Yeah, they would have to be pretty convincing Torah scholars to carry the day in that situation. But I guess Torah scholars would have a better chance of doing that than laymen. Right? Maybe that's the concept. And finally, Sharon, the lesson of the Torah scholars' escorts reminded me of what I learned training a service dog. There are no misbehaviors, just opportunities for correction. So true for so much of our educational process. Yes, right? I mean, so often, I just heard a story told yesterday where, a teacher was so frustrated with this one student and said, either that student gets on Ritalin or he can't be in my class anymore because he's totally out of control. And so they said, fine, the school, the parents, the students said, fine, we'll give the Ritalin to the student. But what ended up happening is that the Ritalin was given to the teacher. And then the teacher said, oh, wow, the student's behavior has improved so much. But it wasn't the student, right? It was the teacher who changed and went on the medication. And so often, we think that the student is the problem. And sometimes there are problem students. But sometimes the teacher is the problem, and the teacher has to examine their own teaching methods to see if there's a different way to reach the unruly student. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday, at the regular Monday time, 6 p.m. Pacific, and God willing, we'll do a double daf tomorrow and get a little closer to caught up.